Welcome to Harlow on Healthcare. I'm David Harlow, and I invite you to join me by my virtual hearth as I sit down with healthcare leaders to discuss building the future of healthcare. Today, my guest is Micky Tripathi. He is the president and CEO of the Massachusetts eHealth Collaborative, a nonprofit health IT advisory and clinical data analytics company, and is a nationally recognized leader in health information technology. Micky's also active in the industry at a local and national level, and he's on the board of directors of the New England Health Exchange Network, the Sequoia Project, the Karen Alliance, and the FHIR Foundation. He's also the project manager of the Argonaut Project, an industry collaboration working on accelerating the adoption of FHIR. He's served on a number of ONC committees and is now affiliated with the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard. Thanks for joining us, Micky, and welcome.
Sure. Thank you, David. Looking forward to it.
So let's start in with a discussion of interoperability, which is certainly a consistent theme running through your activities. I'd like to ask you to tell us a little bit about progress over time in what I would call point-to-point interoperability, provider to provider, provider to patient, and also how that's morphing to a broader effort to create large-scale system-wide interoperability.
Okay, sure. So I'm actually, just get to the end and I'll work my way back, which is to say that I'm very sanguine about where we are with interoperability, and I'm really bullish about the progress that we've made as well as what lies ahead, and not just ahead in the longer term, but in the immediate and short term, like in the next 12 to 18 months. And so, when I think about that, I think it's really important for us to have a little bit of perspective on the interoperability journey we've been on the clinical side in the U.S. That, I hear a lot of cynicism and, people who, a lot of complaining often that, that we're not where we're supposed to be in interoperability and we're way behind the rest of the economy, and, why is healthcare pathologically so bad at this stuff? And I like to, sort of point out that it wasn't until 2013 or so that over 50% of providers had electronic health records. Before that, they just didn't. When ARA and HITECH passed in 2008, 2009, the adoption rate of electronic health records was something like 10%. And those were, many of them homegrown, Microsoft Access database kind of electronic health records. Just like you can't have a phone network without telephones, and you can't have an ATM network without ATMs, it's very hard to have meaningful clinical interoperability if people don't have electronic documentation and interaction systems. So when I think of when the clock should start ticking on interoperability, I put it at the 2014, 2015 timeframe to say, okay, that's when you started to see the odds were going to be that the doc around the corner, if you're a PCP, the doc around the corner was going to have an electronic health record as well. And now we can really start to dig in and start to think about how we're going to have interoperability. The progress we've made has been pretty good considering the late start that we've gotten in terms of, adoption down at the user level, and the fact that healthcare delivery is so much more fragmented than any other part of the economy that you can really think of. It's getting more consolidated now, but it's historically been very fragmented when you think about physician offices and community hospitals and the like. We had our early experiments with state and regional health information exchanges. I was very involved in a number of them. And I think that the hope was that that might be a model for having kind of a public utility concept, that you would have an organic flowering of health information exchange activities in different markets where the ingredients were right among providers, payers, both hospitals and ambulatory providers, and payers and employers. And then perhaps in certain markets where you had, sort of a little bit of a magic synergy, like in Indianapolis, where, they have a flourishing HIE, Providence, Rhode Island, some other places, we did see these, health information exchanges emerge as, kind of a public utility sort of model, where they were aggregating data and providing it back to providers to support treatment decisions at the point of care and other kinds of things. But what we quickly found, I think, was that was just not a scalable model. There was too much heterogeneity across the market. There were lots of markets where the dynamics just weren't there. It just wasn't going to work. And so it wasn't really until we got to a point where we have real electronic health record penetration at a pretty deep level, and then the vendors, ironically, the EHR vendors themselves, who had enough market presence themselves, and especially the large ones, who decided at that point that they were really the only ones who had enough presence across the market and in all markets to be able to say, we're the only ones here who can put this together and create these interoperability networks that have a number of the key features that one would need to have true nationwide interoperability, namely ubiquitous availability in every market in the country or almost every market in the country, and deep integration into the day-to-day workflows of providers. Because if you don't have those two things, then it's really, really hard to make these things work. So right now, I think that's what we're seeing is the growth and fruition of like CommonWell and CareQuality. Both of them, were sort of inspired by vendors. Now they have, provider organizations and others who are part of them, and having really nationwide interoperability in those two networks to be able to exchange real medical record information to support point of care treatment decisions. And we can talk about this in a little more detail in a second. But those networks are now coming together to the point that I think we sort of have the foundation laid, and now it's going to be implementation activity that's really going to be the focus over the next few years.
Right. So there's some recent announcements about the collaboration involving CareQuality and CommonWell, and I'm wondering if you could add a little color to that. What is in place? What is the foundation that's been built? What is the implementation that will need to happen in order for this to be realized at the provider or patient level?
Sure. These networks have had an interesting sort of origins. There are really two networks, two kind of parallel networks in a way. One of them, CommonWell, and both of them, were founded relatively recently. I think CommonWell was founded, in 2014 or 2015, and CareQuality even later, perhaps 2016. So they're not very old. But CommonWell was formed by a group of vendors, Cerner, athenahealth, Meditech, Greenway, Allscripts, who got together and decided that they wanted to put down an infrastructure for interoperability, and in particular for exchange of continuity of care documents, which are these standardized XML documents that are both machine readable and human readable, like you can pop one in a browser and look at it. And they contain what's known as the common clinical data set, which is roughly 20 clinical data elements that most people, I think are part of the core of what a basic medical record kind of snapshot would contain, like problems, allergies, meds. So Commonwealth built that network, and that started to get a little bit of traction. And then meanwhile, CareQuality formed with a slightly different group of vendors. There were some overlapping vendors, and they formed, and they also built a network that had a slightly different architecture, but the information that they were exchanging was the same information. It was the same. It was the continuity of care document containing the same information. So you had these growing in parallel over a couple of years, and each of them, making real progress. And I kind of liken it to, AT&T and Verizon, as if, both of them kept growing their networks, but they weren't connected. So within the network, it's great. It looks like some good stuff is going to happen, but I have lots of friends who are on the other network, and I'd really like to be able to talk to them. So in December 2016, the networks agreed that they are going to essentially build a bridge across their networks to allow the exchange of continuity of care documents so that you didn't have to have provider organizations who were thinking, I have to join both networks, or, I have to choose my vendor based on which network they're on. The idea would be you should just choose your vendor and then be able to exchange with anyone else who's on any of the networks. So they agreed in December 2016 to do that, and then have spent the last 2 years roughly on the implementation. And it's not as simple as it sounds in terms of the implementation, because each of them has different architectures. So CareQuality is a very flat architecture, meaning it facilitates peer-to-peer or point-to-point transactions between provider organizations. So if I'm Kaiser, let's say, I can exchange information with Sutter. I can request a document from Sutter and then get one back from Sutter, and then vice versa. Sutter can request one from me and get one back. And there's no central infrastructure or anything. It's really just CareQuality essentially is just a network that identifies that, yes, all these people on the network are who they claim to be. But then it basically says, and now all of you just exchange as you're going to exchange. And there's no infrastructure in the center, so CareQuality really just is kind of an agreement with some enforcement of security and a set of rules of the road. CommonWell, by contrast, has a central infrastructure. And the reason they have that is because from the beginning, their goal was to solve a key problem in health information exchange, which is patient matching and identity matching. And so from the start, they said, we're going to build a central infrastructure because we have a higher level aim, which is to create better patient matching than just exists out there in the wild. And so they created a central infrastructure where the idea was that they are going to identify and have record location. They're going to identify where patient records are, have robust matching technology to match up identities, and then they have a central record location service where you could look up David Harlow, and you could see, oh, here are the 5 places where David Harlow has records, and then you could form a request through that infrastructure to go and get those records. CareQuality, by contrast, you can't look up where is David Harlow. You would basically have to go in and hit every site and say, hey, do you have David Harlow's records? No? Yes? Do you have David Harlow's records? So you would kind of blast, a set of endpoints based on some knowledge you have. Now, it's smart blasting. It's not dumb blasting. I mean, you might have told the provider, or they might have knowledge of previous relationships, so they might do it within a geographic radius. So there was some reconciliation that they had to do from an implementation and an architecture perspective to say, all right, how are we going to make these two architectures work in a way that's going to make sense for the users, so it's invisible to them, right? A user shouldn't have to worry about, I'm on CommonWell, I'm in CareQuality. They should just be able to say, I just want to get a record from that provider on this patient, and I want to get it securely. So that's the work that's been underway, and we're now at the point where they're in limited production. The announcements that just came out in the last 2 weeks were announcing that they're in limited production, meaning that there are a couple of, I forget how many, there's 2 or 3 sites that are in the CareQuality network that are Epic users, and there's a few sites on the CommonWell side who are on Cerner and Greenway, and they are exchanging information now across the networks in full production. I mean, they have no restrictions on what they can ask, obviously, within the constraints of HIPAA and all of that. And everything's going very well, and the expectation is that that'll be made available for general availability of all CommonWell customers sometime in the next couple of months. I think what the announcement I saw was, hopefully by the end of the summer or the early fall. And so at that point, what that would mean is that the network says, okay, members, you can do this now. If you're a CommonWell member, you can query for a record for any CareQuality member, and vice versa. If you're a CareQuality member, you can request a record from any CommonWell member who has essentially turned on the functionality. And that's where we have a little bit of the implementation work now to have happen. So, just to make it very concrete, CommonWell as a network says, okay, the gate's open, you can do it. Well, now it's up to Meditech to go to all their customers and say, this is now available to you, here's the contract, please sign the contract, the rules of the road for CareQuality, so that everyone's in good understanding of what the rules of the road are for that. And then as soon as that's available, then they'll turn them on. On the CareQuality side, most Epic customers are actually live on CareQuality, and then a lot of the hard work will be on the CommonWell side with all of those the Cerner, Meditech, Greenway sites that each of those vendors is going to have to start working very hard toward. But there's already, even with those announcements, each of the vendors is already getting a lot of requests from their provider organizations saying, hey, where's the contract? Where can I sign up? Because
Sure.
I'm ready. I've got an Epic shop across town.
If you're just tuning in, this is Harlow on Healthcare, coming to you on Healthcare Now Radio. I'm David Harlow, and my guest today is Micky Tripathi. So, Micky, you've sketched out the current state of affairs in terms of a step forward on the interoperability path, and this seems to be driven primarily by developments in the private sector, capabilities that are driven by EHR companies and behind them by provider organizations. There's been a lot of talk and a lot of activity over the past year or so from Washington. There's the 21st Century Cures Act. There's TEFCA that's working its way through the development process. Do these have an effect? Are these driving these efforts forward? Are they going to result in something different, parallel? Do they undergird these efforts in some way, or how do they relate?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think right now I would say it remains to be seen, because 21st Century Cures had language in there that specifically pointed to the federal government's doing something with respect to facilitating trusted exchange and creating rules around information blocking. But and there's a draft rule out now called TEFCA, which is about Trusted Exchange Framework and Cooperative Agreement, which has proposed an architecture for how this type of exchange, this type of query retrieve exchange for continuity of care document information would happen across the country. But that was a draft rule, and there were a lot of comments back from industry
Yes.
And now they're in the process of revising that, and they haven't announced when the final rule is going to be. So the reason I say it remains to be seen is, my personal perspective is that the rule as written, if that was what ended up getting passed, I'm very concerned that would, in effect, be sort of a regulatory wet blanket on all of the private sector activity that's going on right now. And the reason I say that is that, as I mentioned, both of these networks, which together represent vendors who have, roughly 80% of providers covered by those vendors, are now at the point where all they have to do is implement. I mean, they've got, the agreements in place, the technology is in place, the workflows are in place, there's clearly demand, and they just have to implement. And now you have this regulatory architecture that could be forced upon all of this, which would require everyone to rethink how they're doing things in ways that would slow down, if not halt, a lot of this progress for a while. So, I'm very concerned about that. Now, I will say, on the other hand, I think if it ends up being, sort of pulled back based on the comments I got from industry to say, let's have some agreements in some kind of, perhaps very light regulatory, and my desire would be for less regulatory and more incentive-based and more, sort of market-driven through the activities of CMS and DoD and VA, but more of an approach that basically says everyone needs to, agree that you will respond to requests for records. Things like that basically just say, from a functional perspective, we just need to agree that you're going to agree to certain things that are basics of good behavior related to treatment of patients. You will respond to requests from other entities for records. You will not block those requests for any reasons outside of security, what have you, and setting some ground rules for that, and then leaving it at that. I think those would be good things, but
right.
What I get concerned about is the creation of a business and technology architecture that gets forced on industry, that forces everyone, not just CommonWell and CareQuality, but all of the local and state HIEs would have to rethink what they're doing, change their contracts, and I think that would slow down a lot of progress.
Right. Medicare has issued, as part of their draft rules this year, request for information, intimating that they will put out a rule at some point that would add a condition of participation that requires participating providers to deliver records to patients when requested. I imagine that could be expanded to deal with requests from other providers as well. Is that the sort of approach that you're thinking would be a good thing to happen, whether it's through Medicare and then something parallel from the VA or other payers?
Yeah, something like that perhaps. The reason I'm sort of a little bit hesitant is that doing it as a condition of participation, the challenge with that is then you have to start defining what these things mean in right, in an area where the business relationships are dynamic and fluid, the technology is dynamic and fluid, and so you almost always end up being precisely wrong in what you do. And I know, we've had some experience in Massachusetts where, you may recall, David, that there were rules that the Massachusetts state government created about, as a matter of licensure, providers had to be connected to the state health information exchange, and all of a sudden it became this morass that they never emerged from, and they essentially set it aside because they couldn't define these key concepts like, what does it mean to be connected? What does it mean to be a provider? What does it mean to use? Right? You start to, all of a sudden it becomes this incredible slippery slope of, what does that actually mean? And you start defining these things. So, for my druthers, that, maybe there is something that could be carefully crafted related to setting a rule, an expectation that providers will do that. But, pushing more on some of the other levers you were talking about, which is DoD, VA, entities like that, essentially, sort of setting the example by going out and aggressively doing this kind of thing in the market. That can have a huge impact on the market.
Right. And by doing that in the market, you mean through some sort of action in their own facilities, or payment incentives of some sort, or quality incentives of some sort?
Yeah, I was thinking of actions through their own facilities. So basically, the VA and DoD, for example, participating in CommonWell and CareQuality and being exemplars of good network behavior. Join CommonWell and CareQuality and be the biggest exchanger on both of those networks. Right. That I think would set an example that everyone would start following, and could drive a lot of market activity, much more than a regulatory approach that says, thou must do this, and then everyone turns to their attorneys Nothing against attorneys, David, but everyone turns, goes to their attorneys then and says, okay, now what is it that I have to do? What can I get away with, right? I just don't think that that's the right way we want to be approaching this.
So we've talked a lot about the technical solutions to arriving at a future ideal state of interoperability of health records, or at least a step along that pathway. And I think it's important to step back for a moment and consider, because you work with a lot of provider organizations, and you also have sort of a 30,000-foot view on health IT systems. What are we working towards in all of this? What are the benefits of health IT interoperability? Why is this important? To whom is this important? Are we talking about population health? Are we talking about analytics capabilities? Is it something else, something more specific, something broader? Why do you think this is all important?
Ultimately, I think it's about that full stack of everything you just talked about, but we have to start at the foundation and keep building our way up. And some of those things may be that they're actually different things, though we want to put them all in the same box, right? And what I mean by that is, it may very well be that we shouldn't be thinking that the architectures and the networks that we create for exchange of information for care and treatment purposes are going to be the same networks that are going to support population health and are going to support deeper analytics and all of that. I mean, we've sort of as an industry, I think, have fallen into the trap of just assuming that, health information exchange is going to support all of that. We're going to have the living healthcare system, or whatever that was called, that people talked about, rather than thinking, well, I've got a set of transactions and network paradigms that work for particular types of exchange patterns, like direct-based exchange with a capital D, which is basically secure email, for being able to push information to the next provider of care, or being able to retrieve information from the next provider of care. And that's all great for exchange of information that just supports a clinician who needs to make some decisions about patients who are going to be appearing in their office that day or the next day. The higher bar starts to come in where you start to want to be able to do things like population health and things like deeper analytics. And I think that those networks perhaps could serve as the core foundation for those, but it may be that, that there are other ways that we have to think about being able to get that data, like, an API approach that's much more focused on, sort of your trading partners, which is in the category of interoperability, but it's much more about transactional type of interoperability in more of a, smaller circle of provider arrangements than you might think of as CommonWell and CareQuality, which are essentially just sort of commodity exchange at the lowest level for being able to make sure that medical records are available for care and treatment. So one can imagine, for example, there's a lot of work being done now within the Argonaut project on bulk data access using FHIR APIs. So the idea of that is, right now we have FHIR APIs that many people may be familiar with what Apple announced early in the year. We're implementing the Argonaut implementation guide. You, as an Apple iPhone user, can get access to your record, and you can download that record onto your phone. That's a one person at a time kind of model. And the idea of known as bulk data access is, well, what if I'm an accountable care organization, or what if I'm a health plan? I want to be able to use that same type of FHIR API, but not for one patient at a time. I want to be able to do it for my entire panel. I've got 3,000 patients, and I want to be able to get that kind of information. So we're doing a bunch of work right now on this bulk data access notion, where the idea would be that you would have organizations that could expose a FHIR server and a FHIR API that would allow organizations who have developed trust, who have a trust arrangement in some way that happens, sort of out of band, as it's called, meaning that it doesn't happen, as a part of being a part of a network. It happens because I talk to you and I say, you're a part of this accountable care organization, and we need to be able to get that data, and then we have those arrangements. But from a technical perspective, it essentially is plug and play. So I've created the technology for interoperability to happen at a deeper level. But from a technology perspective, I've built those interoperability railroad tracks, and to be able to do that in a plug-and-play way. I know I'm torturing the analogies here, but I'm still negotiating that among a set of parties who have some kind of contractual or business relationship that is more than just commodity care coordination. They have higher-level aims with respect to business, clinical care, and what have you. So I think there are sort of multiple layers here. It isn't as if everyone needs to use every type of transaction. As you go into these higher level kinds of things, they get much more specialized, and we want to make them as easy to use as possible, but still recognize that they are deeper types of interoperability that you're not going to have with everyone. There are some trading partners who you have sort of light interoperability, like you just need direct because I just want to make sure that the record follows the patient, but I don't have a risk arrangement with you. I only exchange with you, the specialist across the, on the other side of the state 10 times a year. So I'm certainly not going to invest in anything where, we're having some kind of deep relationship with respect to aligning our care practices and getting more data than is available in a continuity of care document, for example. People think of interoperability being a switch. I like to say it's not a switch. It's not an off or an on. It's actually it's more like a dial. So there are some organizations where the dial is on the light side. It's a low volume because I just have the episodic kinds of things. We exchange patients once in a while. Yes, I want to make sure that records are available. But there are some organizations who we are in this together in a very deep way. We're at risk. If I mess up on what I've done with the patient, I'm going to get that readmission within 30 days, and I really don't want that. So I'm going to work at a deeper level with you, and I'm going to turn the dial all the way up on the interoperability to make sure that we're exchanging information that's richer and higher frequency and as close to real time as possible so that we can work together to collectively get a result that we both agree that is in our mutual interest.
Okay. So, Micky, as my final question, I'd like to ask you, if you were to wake up tomorrow and find yourself 5 years in the future, what is one thing in healthcare that you would hope or expect has changed drastically?
Two things. One is I hope that when providers think about interoperability at that point, they have no idea what CommonWell or CareQuality or any of these networks are, in the same way that they barely understand who their phone service provider is, but they don't give a whole lot of thought to it. They pick up a phone and then they just use it, and it has the same basic functionality whether you're on Sprint, Verizon, AT&T, what have you. So I would be delighted if 5 years from now that's where we are with basic core interoperability, that providers don't care whether they're on Cerner, Greenway, athenahealth. Their experience of being able to get records from other providers is the same and something they don't even need to think about. The other thing I hope in parallel is that we've got sort of a real live and mature API and app ecosystem, both for providers and patients, so that you as a patient and you as a provider have the ability in a relatively easy way be able to take your app and connect it up to get your information or the information you're authorized to get and do cool things with it and be able to have sort of a real app store kind of concept like we experience in the rest of our lives. If we can get to a point where those two things are really happening 5 years from now, I think we'll have accomplished a lot.
I would have to agree. That sounds like a nice vision for the future. Thank you very much for taking the time, Micky. I've enjoyed this conversation.
Great. Likewise. Thank you, David.
You have been listening to Harlow on Healthcare. Join us at healthcarenowradio.com. Let's continue the conversation on building the future of healthcare together at #HarlowOnHC. I'm David Harlow, keeping the fire going and holding a seat open for you. Until next time.